Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar series. This is the second installment of What's Next for Low-Cost Private Schools in India. My name is Renée McAlpin. I'm the Director of the Education Quality Program at Opportunity EduFinance. We focus on increasing access to financing for low-cost private schools and also professional development training for school leaders and for teachers. We do this work across South Asia, Africa, and also Latin America. And so this session today focuses on the access to professional development for low-cost private schools, thinking about the opportunities and barriers for education service providers given the changing ecosystem of education. This builds upon our recent market assessment research that we did with KPMG India earlier this year. And we've taken this opportunity to bring together a really diverse set of stakeholders across the education ecosystem to really talk about what we are moving toward, especially considering the impact of COVID-19 and the national education policy that was released last year, and thinking through, who's doing the good work, what's working, what are the challenges, where are areas for increased collaboration, and what we can do collectively to really tackle the big challenges that are ahead of us. So I want to take this moment to introduce our panelists. So we have Azad Oommen, who is the co-founder of Global School Leaders, a nonprofit that develops effective school leadership to improve child-level learning outcomes across Asia and Africa. We also have Lavanya Jayram, who is the executive director of South Asia at AVPN. She leads efforts in establishing AVPN in the region with philanthropic members such as corporates, foundations, trusts, and individuals. And we also have Anjali Nambar, who is the program director at Mantra for Change. They take a systemic approach to addressing the issue of poor quality education in under-resourced schools. So we have a really great lineup of speakers today who will really talk about everything from the micro level, what's happening at the school level right now, what are teachers and school leaders faced with, talking about education service providers across the sector and what's working in school leadership and what are the ongoing needs. And then also talking about the financing and impact and what are we seeing at the macro level in terms of trends. So I'd like to start with you, Azad. If you could tell us a little bit about what you see as some of the professional development needs of school leaders and teachers, thinking about really the leadership aspect and what you see across the partners that you work with in your work as well.
Thanks, Renée, and it's good morning for me here. I'm in California. It's a pleasure to be here on this panel, and I'm so delighted to be in the company of Lavanya and Anjali. AVPN and Mantra for Change are both organizations that we've known for a long time, and it's great to see them on this panel as well. So, in terms of the work that we've been doing with low-fee private schools, we have been working in India for a while on this. I used to lead the Central Square Foundation, where we had done quite a bit of work around low-fee private schools. And then I was on the board of the India School Leadership Institute, which was also focusing somewhat on low-fee private schools. And currently in our work with Global School Leaders, we work with low-fee private schools around the world, both in India, but also in Kenya. We're just starting some work in Ghana with low-fee private schools and also in Indonesia. And so we just actually are in the middle of analyzing some numbers from a survey we did of school leaders across these countries. So we did a survey of about 4,000 school leaders from across the world, and about 500 of them were from low-fee private schools. So these are not India-specific numbers, but I think three things emerged from that, and this resonates with the work that we're seeing in India that's being done by our partner Alokit, which is on the ground training school leaders, both in the government system as well as in the low-fee private school system. So there were three things that were emerging for us from the survey. One is that for low-fee private schools, obviously financial challenges are a huge concern. So we know schools have been closed for a year in India, a year counting still. And these schools have not had access to the revenue that they usually depend upon for their work. And so that's a huge challenge for them. And they talk about that a lot in terms of what's top of their mind. The second thing is that the pandemic has taken a huge toll on school leaders and school communities. So around 40% of school leaders reported that they had lost a child or the parent of a child during the pandemic. And we also know that teachers also have been very affected by this. And one of the things we found was that these school leaders are really not, don't have the tools to deal with this, right? So it's like they've not been trained as mental health professionals, and now they're being asked to care for their school communities. So during the April wave, we partnered with an organization called Because You, which works with mental health issues among organizations, and we ran learning circles for about 500 school leaders across the country in India. And that was just an opportunity for them to really just come and have a chance to think about what's going on and to process what was going on. And we weren't quite sure what the response was going to be, because who knows, if you do a online mental health support group, what will happen. But we were really, really surprised by the participation and the interest and all of this. Yeah. So the second challenge that we see broadly is, how do school leaders deal with the mental and social and emotional well-being of themselves, their teachers, their students, and their communities, right? And how are they equipped to do that? And then the third, which is obviously the biggest from many educational people's standpoint, is this issue of how you're going to deal with learning losses among children, right? So one of the things we found through the survey was that a third of low-fee private school leaders were saying that they had less than 25% of their children had access to technology during the last year, right? So that's a lot of children who had, considering that everybody had pivoted to online learning, that's a lot of children who had no access to online learning during this time. And we know from the broader numbers that are emerging from the Indian ecosystem that that children have suffered huge learning losses during this past year. Our partner Alokit has done some interesting work where when they have supported school leaders and helping them think through how to structure online learning, how to go beyond online learning to reach out to students, that you can actually stem learning losses. So we're trying now to see how we can support school leaders as we emerge from the pandemic to deal with the learning losses. So those are the three broad themes I'd just like to put out there as what we are seeing. So one is this whole issue of financial challenges and how do you deal with that. The second is dealing with social and emotional well-being, and then the third is dealing with learning losses. And I think there are professional development opportunities in all of these, right? Because if you think about it, from our previous experience, professional development was something that school leaders were not that keen to invest in, particularly in the low-fee private schools, just because money is always tight, and that didn't make it. It's not easy to pass on that cost to parents. And so given that now, as they're emerging into this extremely financially constrained situation, how can we ensure that there is some professional development for them and that they are equipped to deal with this once in a lifetime challenge? So let me stop there, and happy to contribute more later.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And a really quick follow-up question for you, and something that we saw in our KPMG work is obviously the massive need for upskilling digital literacy and access to digital tools, both on the school side and then, of course, at the student and learner side. From your experience and what you're seeing across partners, have you seen any effective solutions in this area that you think has staying power and will continue to be used, in the years to come?
Yeah, the one, in general, what we found, so there were two things that we did during, our partner Alokit in India did during this past year. One was just a general sort of support to school leaders, orienting them to think about how do you sort of generally engage students in learning. And what we found was that the simpler you keep it, the better it is. So, if however much you can deliver through WhatsApp or text messages, things like this, that's the best thing to do, just because the more you add on, the more complicated it gets and the harder it is for kids to access learning. So that was one thing. The second thing that we did was we did a partnership with this group out of Botswana, actually called Young Love. And they've been working with a text message plus phone coaching methodology. around where they're actually, rather than delivering generic lessons to children over the phone, they've actually been targeting it to the child's learning level. And we did a very, very small pilot with them, but the results from that were quite remarkable. And Young Love has done this across, I think it's 5 countries in the world, and India was one of them. So we're very, very excited about potentially scaling that up. And there, what it is that the school leader basically drives the teachers to check in with their students on I think it's a weekly basis, where the children get some assignments that are targeted towards their learning level, and then they get a follow-up phone call from their teacher. But basically, it's like, I think for us, the real mantra in this time has been, how do you keep it as simple as possible so that, the technology isn't getting in the way of learning.
No, that's really helpful to know. Thank you. And I'd like to pivot on the point you made about the financing piece, and actually go to Lavanya now, who works with all sorts of funders and investors in large networks across South Asia and India, and specifically, could you talk to us a little bit about how you see trends in the funding, and especially how that trickles down to the school level, where schools are able to invest in professional development and quality improvements?
Sure. Thanks, Renée. And hi, Azad, Anjali. Nice to be here with you today. So firstly, I just thought we should look at the scale of what's at hand, right? 5% of the world's budgets on education is being spent in India, right? And while that number seems so huge, it's catering to 20% of the world's population of children. So we already know what a huge skew there is in terms of budget versus the need in the system. We go to what kind of public funds are available in this sector right now. My data may be a few years old, but we were in the 50-60 billion range for the budget in terms of education, right? With the new National Education Policy 2020, the kind of ambitious goals that have been set, all in good intention, it requires now, as the report says, 173 billion per year for the next 10 years until the SDG goals measurement on 2030 happens. So the scale in front of us is that mammoth, tripling our budgets in that space. So public funds are not going to be sufficient. We then move to the funders that you spoke of, our members. We work closely with a lot of the funds. One of the most popular areas for investment for all our funders across the country, and in fact globally as well, is in the space of education, right? But even that high top number one popularity is not meeting the needs of what is required on the ground. And even then now, if you slice that down further into what kind of funds really are attracting what kind of areas in education, it's nowhere in the areas that Azad mentioned, right? Which is the real need, where the learning development, the professional development, learning losses, the investment is not in those areas where the grave concerns are today, right? They are largely skewed towards the edtech side. Now, one may argue that edtech will be enablers for these areas of development, but at the same time, they're going to be investing in technology companies. They're going to take time to make those solutions robust, scalable, and the numbers, as we heard already, are so mammoth, right? So it really requires very large shifts in government policy on funding, on loans, financial institutions to put their neck out and really make a lot of changes in the system there. I'm sure we'll talk about that more as we go. But yes, I wanted to give that bizarre scale and number out there, and whether the investments are going into the areas where the real solutions are required, right? So maybe we'll place that dilemma and then come back later.
Yeah, no, that was really helpful, I think, to really show the size of need and the amount of funding that's really going to be required with the new education policy. And are you starting to see, private capital step up? So aside from public funding, you're looking at the other corporates and investors, are you starting to see them recognize the need? So the ones who were there before doubling down, and are you seeing any new actors come into that space?
Absolutely. Like I said, it is the most popular area for investors to be in. So there are the existing players who are, like you said, doubling down, doing more, and also focusing on capacity building, resilience, this whole theme about build back better post the trauma that we've all faced in the COVID-19 phase, right? So a lot of old funders doing more, a lot of new players coming into the space as well. But one of the white spaces, if I may call it so, is really the early child education. That again is completely amiss in the entire investment landscape. Whereas we all, being in the sector, are aware on how important early child education is for them to perform better in the later years. Fortunately, the NEP addresses that pretty well, and brings focus on Anganwadis, the entire early years segment. So hopefully, the funders also will swerve towards that area and make more investments in early child education.
Yeah, and what we saw from the KPMG work that we did earlier this year is that NEP offers a lot of really great solutions, but it's the actual reality, the funding and the implementation that's going to be the massive hurdle for all of us. Thank you for that. And so now kind of looking at the macro, so bringing it back a little bit from the perspective that Lavanya just gave us. And so Anjali, could you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in your work, specifically at the school level? What are teachers saying? What are school leaders saying? And what is the reality of COVID-19 for them? And are they starting to even think about NEP at this point?
Sure. Thank you so much, Renée. And it's a real privilege to be on this panel with such important voices. So just talking about what the schools are saying. We have been in touch with a lot of the private schools that we're working with. And at least initially, when we started out with the whole pandemic, the kind of issues that they were talking about were things like, teachers were not getting ration. So that was like things that they were thinking about. Teaching, professional development was just not something that they were thinking about at that point. It was just about survival and survival of the school, survival of their community. So that's where it started off. But right now, they're reaching a place where things are a little more settled. They are trying to figure out how to continue their schools in a way that they can provide basic education to the students that are still coming to their schools. So what we are seeing is schools are trying to see how they can raise funds apart from the fees that they get from parents as well. And some of the things that school leaders have reached out to us for is in terms of how do we raise funds through, say, CSR funding. Those kind of things are catching up in terms of other ways in which they can fundraise. So there are schools that have started registering themselves as trusts, and they are getting ATG certificates. So that's the direction towards which schools are trying to sort of reinvent themselves. And that's in the administrative front to say, how do we continue schools with the same amount of quality education that we were giving to the students earlier. But there is also this other part of the pedagogical aspect to say, how are we preparing our teachers in a way that they can continue imparting education with the best possible methods. So digital literacy is something that's coming up as a need. Remediation is coming up as a need in terms of students that they are engaging with. I think 6 to 12 standard is coming back to the schools right now. And we're seeing almost a 3-year gap in the kind of learning levels that they have currently. So how do we remediate for that? Learning loss is something that they are grappling with right now. And what we're seeing in terms of NEP and in terms of the rollout, at least in Karnataka, the rollout is starting to happen, and they are trying to look at how the policy can be made into an implementable guideline. And there are certain guidelines that are being sent to schools, especially for the 10th to 11th, 12th transition. So they are just getting a hang of it. But what we're seeing is there's a lot of professional development happening for government schools. the Nipun Bharat, all of those trainings are going out for government schools, but private schools, the teachers there have not yet been, it's not yet reached the private schools yet. So these are some of the things that we are seeing in terms of, where the private schools stand right now. But they definitely do have significance in the current scenario, because there are students who are going into government schools from private schools, just because the fees is, there's no fees there. And right now they just want to put their students somewhere. But in the government schools, the enrollment is going like through the roof. And they will not be able to cater to all of the students that's coming from the private school scenario. So definitely these private schools do have significance in the next, in the future. So these are some of the realities that we are seeing and hearing from the ground. I think I would end there.
And I have a few quick follow-up questions. You raised some really great points. Thinking about some of the challenges we had with education quality before COVID, those still exist, right? And then we have the added bit on needing to upskill digital literacy, and then also mitigating learning loss. One of the big challenges that we've also seen in our own work is the lack of time and interest in professional development. Are you seeing a shift in that? School leaders and teachers prioritizing this, given that now the need is now compounded? And is there a willingness? What are you seeing in terms of kind of the mindset and any shift there?
Yes, that's a really interesting point. So at least in the beginning of the pandemic, we had seen a complete dip in the need for these professional development trainings, or any kind of such approaches were completely sidelined. But right now we're seeing them reach out a lot more in terms of, like you said, there's a larger need coming from their side, saying that now that we're opening, we really need to equip our teachers with the kind of skill sets that are required in terms of continuing education on a digital platform and in their schools, in the classrooms itself. And we are hearing a lot more from the school leaders, and it's definitely increased. And I can see that as a trend where, it did dip and then right now it's rising. And we are seeing people be more open and more receptive to trainings. And they're also in a mind space to be able to take it in and, sustain the practices in their school. So that's something that we're definitely seeing. Yes.
Well, that's really promising, because the willingness has to be there before anything else can happen, right? And so another really quick question for you. You mentioned, the burden and the influx that is now being presented to the government and school system because of, private schools having been closed for so long, and some of them potentially shutting down and not being able to pay their teachers. Do you see any shifts in policy to kind of help balance that equilibrium? Because obviously this could present some really big issues both for the private school sector and for the government sector. And do you see a real recognition to the value of low-cost private schools? What are you kind of seeing at the policy level?
Yes, definitely. I think this is something that has come up in bits as well, where there was a push for a policy of for paying private school teachers by the government. There was a phase where that was initiated, and I think some schools were also being paid by the government. So there are places where the government is trying to take on that load of private schools continuing, because it just the sheer numbers, like what Lavanya said, cannot be taken up completely only by the government. So they are starting to recognize that, and there are certain very actionable attempts being taken at supporting the private schools as well. And I think that's starting off, and I think that will just continue now. There are certain policy level changes that are happening, even with respect to the Diksha platform itself. There are places where the private school teachers are being encouraged to use the platform to go through certain training modules. So such integration we are seeing happen, where the government is completely, aware of the fact that they cannot completely cater to the needs of all the students right now, and they are acknowledging the fact that it is important to have the private players also kind of, partner in the effort that they're making. So yeah, definitely. I think that's something that we are seeing.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really helpful to know. And particularly going back to the other point and seeing the willingness of school staff to professional development is really important. And on that point, I want to go back quickly to you, Azad. And I know you work with a lot of different education service providers, and now thinking how the willingness and the need of schools has increased. Do you think the service providers that exist in the sector can meet that need? Are they well equipped? Is there enough there? Do you see any kind of misalignment in the market in terms of what schools are asking for and what's actually being provided?
That's an interesting question. I think absolutely there is the capacity to meet the need, the professional development needs. So, whether it's organizations like Mantra for Change or 321 or Alokit, there are a number of different organizations that do maybe not exclusively work with low-fee private schools, but do work with them. And I do think that they do have the potential. It is an interesting time because I think there is also a bit of a squeeze on the philanthropic capital that's out there. I don't know if Lavanya would agree with this or not, but there's certainly, to us it feels like between increased scrutiny around FCRA and domestic funds going into things like the PM Cares Fund. It does feel, at least from my personal experience from talking to a number of friends who lead nonprofits in India, that there is a bit of a squeeze on funds right now. And so it's not the easiest. But having said that, organizations have survived, and so they do have the capacity. And certainly, I think I totally agree with what Anjali was saying in terms of now school leaders are thinking about, okay, how do we invest? I mean, now that the reality of schools opening is becoming clear, now they can think about, okay, how do we invest? Because I think the landscape was so unclear for so long. And I would also say that as one thinks about the NEP, as one thinks about emerging from COVID, they're not necessarily the same things, right? So what you need emerging from COVID is not necessarily what the NEP says, because the NEP wasn't designed with something like COVID in mind. So I think there are tensions within the system as to where do you focus? Do you focus on, because I think, say, for instance, this whole issue of remediation of remedial learning for children, it's one thing in the way that you think about it in the abstract, and then it's another thing to say, okay, now you have to do remedial learning for kids who are coming out of these traumatic experiences, teachers who've lived on the edge, who had to worry about, do we have rations or not, things like this. And now you're suddenly saying, and at least anecdotally, what I see is that people are just going back and saying, okay, we'll just go back to what we knew, and let's move kids through the system, and let's get them out of the system, and let's just pass them through, and that's what the focus is. And so I think there is this tension that has to get resolved in essence at a policy level. I mean, either it has to come from parental demand or from a policy level. My sense is the answer will probably come more from the policy level. One other thing I just wanted to comment upon, which Anjali was saying, was I think that there is the government system really looks to the government system for answers. So the government as a policymaker really looks to the government as a provider of education as where they draw their inspiration from. So there isn't much incentive for innovation in the low-fee private school system, right? So the only incentive there is to get more kids in. So that's where you find the innovation. But I think that, there is so much of an opportunity to innovate in this space, and a lot of that will be driven by professional development. And as you expose people to this, and so I don't know how to solve for this problem, but there is this issue that people are not really looking to the low-fee private school system for answers to the education problems, right? People are saying, well, it has to scale, so let's do it through the government school system, because that's where we can see whether it scales or not. And I think there needs to be some way to figure out, okay, how do you find innovations that are happening in the low-fee private school sector and transfer that over, pick those up and take them into the government sector as well.
And are you starting to see any of that collaboration? I mean, this is something I think about all the time in our own work as well. And how do we build that bridge between the private and the government as well? Because there's a lot that can be shared and learned, but often they work in complete silos, and not just in India, but almost everywhere where we operate. Are you starting to see any real traction into greater collaboration there?
Personally, very little. Anjali may have a different perspective on this because I think she's closer to the ground. But personally, what I see is, at least when I observe training sessions that are being run in India by Alokit, that at least in the beginning, there's this whole thing of like, well, I'm from the government, you're from the private school sector, so we don't really have anything in common, and our challenges are different. But I think when they come down to learning, then they understand that the kid could be in either school and they would be equally, at the same level in terms of learning. And then when the conversation comes down to learning, then it becomes clear that there's a lot of collaboration that's possible. But there's so many systemic barriers to getting to that conversation about learning that it takes some time. But I'd be very curious to hear Anjali's take on this. If she has a thought.
And maybe back to you, Anjali, really quickly, if you are starting to see greater collaboration and in symbiosis between, the private school sector and the government sector, especially given kind of that disruption of the equilibrium that you were talking about.
Sure. Yeah. I think the kind of things that we are noticing is pretty similar to what Azad just spoke about, where there is a gap right now, the kind of bridging or the kind of collaboration that we would expect to have is not really there yet. I mean, we've not really reached there yet. But of course, like within our partners, within the ecosystem that we are working with, we have tried to seed these collaborations. But from like a systems perspective or from their side itself, we haven't seen so much of a collaborative move as such. But yeah, I mean, we are hopeful. We are hopeful that will happen in the future. So yes.
Seems something we all need to work on. So I see some work ahead of us there. And Lavanya, back to you. One more quick talking point before we open up to questions. I know you work with this massive network of funders, investors, and so on. What are you seeing some of the trends from your partners looking at, collaboration as one, and then also looking at trends and impact and how those two, come together?
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, Renée, a lot of our members, and there are, huge number in the space of education, whether it's Unitas or Khosla or Avishkar, all of them are deeply invested in the education space. The trend, though, as I'd mentioned, is a penchant for the area of technology, because the belief is that technology will help make it sustainable and scale as well. So they are largely backing up the edtech companies, the funders, the traditional philanthropists, of course, when it comes to the trusts and foundations. They are into the longer term work on the ground in all the areas we've been discussing, like bringing back children to school, ensuring they're well nourished so that they can, so all the core problems typically are the ones being backed up, at least as a trend in terms of, by the large philanthropic houses, family foundations, and the impact funds trend is largely towards the tech companies. And both are doing good work. So I'm not, really saying it as a color of what's good or bad, but more in terms of where the investment angle goes in. When you know that you need that to run as a business, then it's on the technology angle, right? And that's where the impact funds focus is. So that's the by and large color I'd paint that with.
And, in terms of the technology piece, would you say this has been something consistent even before our current, context with COVID and NEP, and is kind of continued on and heightened a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ION technology was there years back. We've seen a lot of companies come out of it, Hippocampus, Bridge. There are a number of these that have emerged in years, even pre-pandemic. But I think with the pandemic, it's accentuated the need that we are going to need these tech solutions. Even when children go back to school, there is a pattern that has already been set on of a certain amount of content that is going to come through devices, and that they are going to be needing that on a continual mode, even when they go back to school, right? So also with the parent involvement, which was not there as much pre-pandemic, and it is increased now. So the whole rethinking of our education, I think that process has begun. The one good thing that comes out of absurd situations like pandemics is that you need to go back and think about what we need to correct in the old way before we go back to it just right in, right? Like Azad was mentioning, that might be the least path of resistance. You just come back to school and then we'll see what needs to happen. But at the same time, I think we need to build for a future where we take, the learning of the last 1.5 years on what they were making do with as an enabler for a better education in the future. And more holistic, like again, what the NEP is aiming to do. I think they're also talking about making a curriculum that will enable both the online systems as well, and ensuring the infrastructure is also in a manner that enables both the physical and the digital, what they call the phygital. I don't like the word, but
I understand. No, thank you. That was a really, really great point to end on. And now I'd like to transition to some Q&A from our audience. And maybe actually the first one that I see here from Amara, maybe this is one for you, Lavanya, as well. Thinking about what are some of the ways we've seen collaboration between tech, financial, government, and so on, addressing some of the challenges that are faced. And since you kind of have a bird's eye view of a massive network of providers, where do you see some of the key collaborations?
I see that one of the angles, because we mentioned government, is that they've been quite open in the entire policy discussion, right? Engaging with all stakeholders, whether it's large financial institutions, the impact funds, tech companies. They're bringing in that conversation into policy making. We run something called the Policy Lab. It's not on the education side as of now, but on healthcare. But we're seeing that sort of an engagement and a forthcoming government in terms of policy making for the future. And in terms of collaborations, I can see a lot of, one of the problems is that there are a number of companies coming with different solutions for a slice of the problem, right? And really what the schools, as I would understand on the ground, need is an integrated solution and not 10 different products as a thali in front of them, right? They need something that will come together and solve the problem of the child. And so we are seeing a trend of companies who are investing in various areas of the solution coming together to probably create a product or an overall proposition. But I must say that's quite anecdotal and not as much as we'd like that to be.
Yeah, definitely greater collaboration is needed. And I think that that's been a common thread through our conversation today. And I see two other questions here in the Q&A, and they both have a similar focus. And it seems to really talk about the lack of understanding of professional development needs and indicators of quality at the school level, which has an impact on what they ask for as well. And I see, Azad, you've taken yourself off mute. Maybe this is something that you could speak to a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I think, and I would also obviously love to hear Anjali's take on this as well. But I think, and somewhere in the chat, I'd seen something about professional development standards and things like this as in the Q&A. And I think there is, in general, I would say low-fee private schools have less qualified teachers, teaching staff, and by extension, school leaders in terms of their formal academic qualifications, although there is quite a bit of now an emerging body of research around the efficacy and things like this. But I do think that there isn't a clear sense of like what do we need our teachers to know, what is the gap that we have to fill, right? And because so much of the work can be done as it existed before could be done through rote learning. I think with the NEP now, there's probably a little bit greater definition around the range of things that need to happen. I think through platforms like Diksha, through platforms like Firki, which is a Teach for India platform, there's a much greater sort of knowledge base that school leaders can access to support the professional development of their teachers. But what we find is that, at least from our perspective, because the school leaders themselves don't have not been trained in understanding how to effectively deliver instruction to the kids, that they don't really have a vision for their teachers. So whatever the teacher comes in and does is fine, as long as so the kids are passing the exams or whatever. So I think part of it is beginning to just have a common understanding within the school of what it is we're trying to do, what is the vision of the school, what are we actually trying to do, and how do we then equip our teachers to be able to achieve that. But there's very little, I would say, understanding among the school leaders around what it is that they're trying to achieve instructionally.
No, absolutely. And do you see the NEP coming in and creating some of those standards around quality that really help create that benchmark that might help schools in the right direction?
I think it's a strong beginning. I think as I think maybe Lavanya was saying earlier that now or maybe it was Anjali, I don't remember, but the conversation is now moving from, okay, there's this nice shiny policy, and how does it actually get implemented, and what parts of it can get implemented, right? So from our perspective, say, like because we think about school leaders, right, and there are all these expectations of school leaders in the document, but there's no policy around all they say somewhere tucked in is like, school leaders should get 50 hours of professional development a year. But there's no conceptualization of, okay, what is the role of the school leader, of the head teacher, things like this, right? So I think I think that document now needs to be taken and then adapted by different governments, by different organizations, in order to make it tangible and in order to make it something that's implementable.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Anjali, did you have anything you wanted to say on that as well?
Yeah, just wanting to add about the part about NEP making it more clearer in terms of what the professional development standards, so to say, are. What those competencies should be in the teachers and in the school leaders to take forward the kind of change the NEP envisions. What has really improved ever since NEP has come in is it's at least started dialogue. There's a lot of dialogue happening about education, and how can we concentrate a lot on building the professional skill sets among teachers, among school leaders. So that's really come to the forefront ever since NEP. And what we started seeing is very recently, I think NCERT published a handbook on school leaders' competencies, and that's kind of spelling out the sort of competencies they want to see in school leaders to be able to take the professional development to a place where learning outcomes can be met. So they're talking about such things, and it's coming out in the forefront. Nipun Bharat, there are certain presentations that have been shared, certain guidelines that have been shared, which spell out what competencies should be part of the professional development of school leaders, and it's at least coming to the forefront. So I feel the clarity is improving. If you're not there yet, the clarity is improving to say this is what it means to have effective teaching in a classroom or effective school leaders in a school. So that is definitely something that the NEP has at least started the conversation or started those dialogues towards, which I think will then evolve into making those standards for the schools, and then of course percolating into the private schools spaces as well. Yeah,
that's really. Yeah, and talking about the competencies of leadership and that benchmarking, I mean, that's a great first place to start. I mean, once that's there, the willingness of the schools is there for professional development, and the service providers can come in. I mean, that's the ecosystem, right? And that's when all the pieces come together to provide, the ability to grow and make progress. So that's a really great point. Thank you, Anjali. And really quickly, going to Rabia's question on ways organizations are leveraging data. So data is really important, right? And thinking about assessments, thinking about monitoring, evaluation, all of that. And maybe this is a question for all of you in terms of different ways in which you are using data in your work, ways in which you see schools using it or your other partners. Whoever would like to comment on that.
I may not, answer the question completely, but just taking off from what Anjali and Azad was saying on the policy, right? The policy is just probably going to give us that initial momentum to start thinking about the core issues, which of course would be very different from what it was 20 years back or 30 years back, whenever the earlier policy was made, right? So contextualizing it to today's challenges, I think, was an important step that it made, and it's giving us the momentum. I think the next important thing, which is where it's connected to the question, Renée, is the fact that to have a focus on learning outcomes and to have a way of measuring those learning outcomes becomes the next important step, and a link from the intent, which is the policy, to actual, so what are our outcomes and goals and how are we going to get there? How will we measure it? And to make that common across the public and private schools so that there is a parity and less of a gap between the two systems, and there's a common way between them. And then coming to my world, where once those metrics are in place, it will automatically attract the investments, right? Because then they know how to compare one from the other, one investment from the other, because they know what the outcomes would be. So really, I think the policies just kickstarted it. Like Anjali said, the intent is in the right direction. At least, the large picture is out there. And now if we are able to get those, we could start with the competencies that Anjali mentioned, which becomes one of the outcomes you need in your school leaders. And then, build out from there and get the metrics right. And that's where I think data would be really useful, because investors are going to want data. And I'm talking about now the impact investment community. There is, of course, the large financial institutions. This is not going to be one institution's game, right? It's going to be so many of them coming together, collaboration again. We'll need low-cost loans, fast-track loans. We'll need so much more going in that space from the various sectors. So I guess data is going to be extremely critical here on.
Absolutely, and collaboration on that as well. And how can you link service providers to financial providers, linking to those learning outcomes as indicators of success, and thus providing access to more financing for those schools is super important. I see, Azad, you've taken yourself off mute. Did you have any comments on that the data piece?
No, on the data piece, I feel like there's broad systemic stuff happening around data. So because I think there was this realization that all the data that was being collected for DICE and things like that was all input related data. And now we need to move towards outcomes related data to understand what the state of the sector is, so to speak, as it relates to children's learning. And for so long we were just driven by Asar and the fantastic work that they did in terms of highlighting the poor learning outcomes and things like this. But I think now, particularly with the introduction of so much technology now, I think there's a real opportunity to really surface a lot of data. One of the things we've seen is that there aren't easy data systems for school leaders to use, right? So how do you track kids in your school, particularly around there are now systems to track learning outcomes in hard subjects. And now I think the next frontier, particularly given what we're seeing in terms of people's concern around social and emotional well-being, is how do you actually track social emotional learning? What kinds of data systems do you have around that? So I think there's a huge space for technology to play a role in this, in terms of being able to surface this data and actually being able to analyze the data to make it more usable.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. And Anjali?
Just adding on to what I think Lavanya was saying, where, because funding would require, more accurate data and communication through data-driven communication happening. We're seeing school leaders, like I said, they are looking for ways in which fundraising can be taken up by them. So they are seeing the need to put together the data-based outcomes in the school as well. So initially, when we used to go into the school, we would do a lot of assessments. We would do a lot of tracking of the teachers. And that's something that as an interventionist, we would help them do. But now they're seeing the importance of it, to say that why were we doing it in terms of for us to then get the funding and get the program continuing. Right now, they are seeing the fact that for them to continue the fundraising, or if they have to individually raise those funds, data becomes really important for them to understand whether they're moving, whether the shift is happening, and also to be able to present it to somebody else who would be willing to help them out. So that shift is definitely coming through, and data is being looked at as an important factor in that process. So yeah, just adding.
No, that was a really great piece. Thank you for that. And I would like to jump to one more question from the Q&A before we wrap up. And this one is really looking at gender equity. So we have a great question from Catherine. How can professional development organizations address the gender inequities prevalent within leadership and teaching positions? So looking at the staff makeup of the school, and how has COVID-19 affected this or widened the gender gap of what we saw before? And of course, I don't like to always end on the challenge, and what are you all seeing good that's happening, and how are people addressing this? And that's open to all of you.
Yeah, maybe I could just start off, just because we just finished a pilot on this very issue. So we were looking. So it was actually driven by by this fear that girls were not going to come back to school, were not going to re-enroll in school because of their learning losses, because of early marriage, because of all this. And so we ran a pilot actually to see if you invested in training school leaders, how would it impact girls' education? And one of the side products of that was actually looking at this inequity, the gender inequity in the leadership role among women in the education sector, particularly at the school level. So I'm talking not about the whole systemic level, but at the school level, what you find is that typically women are way overrepresented in the teaching population. So you'll have like 70-80% of your teaching staff be women. And then in general, the leadership staff, that changes altogether, right? It flips, and you have men in leadership roles and women not. And that's, to us, that's been really, really interesting to begin to understand. There's very, very little research around this, particularly in the global south. So there has been some focus on this in so some of the Western countries, but very little outside of that. And I think it's a huge issue in terms of both in terms of thinking about girls' education, but even understanding like what are these systemic barriers? Why don't women come into leadership positions? So it's a very, very important topic, but I think that there's very little that's been done on it so far, and I think there's a lot to be done on it going forward.
Yeah, no, I agree. Lavanya or Anjali, any comments there on the gender equity piece?
Yeah, I think I can just add on from where Azad was talking about it. It definitely is something that we're seeing there is definitely a difference. And in terms of the staff in the school as well, they are mostly women. And we have seen that the girls in the school are being taken out of school, or there is some sort of other engagement that they're part of right now. We are trying to see how this can be changed, but again, I mean, it's still something that we are also trying to figure out. The whole conversation about how can we make teaching as a profession itself a lot more, aspirational. That's something I think would be a game changer, because right now that's something that's lacking. And yeah, we're really trying to work towards making this profession something that really builds the teacher as a very important professional in the community. So yeah, that's just something that we're working towards.
Yeah, and that's at all levels, I think, especially early childhood. Yeah, and Lavanya.
Yeah, no, I was just emoting on Anjali's point, because it's such an important thing. We all remember our teachers so fondly when we grow up, and they've been so foundational in our growing up, and then we never aspire to those professions, right? So there is something that's happening midway where they go from our heroes and to us not wanting to be them, right? So what happens? So very, very interesting, and I think something that would be great to work on. From the investing angle, I think this has been observed, of course, and it's an issue across the board, not just unique to education or schools, that we see that the mid-layer, the ratios of male to female is pretty all right, but then as it goes in senior levels, there's a severe drop. So a lot of our investors have this whole gender lens investing. They're preferring to invest in companies or organizations led by women, whether it's Chirate Ventures, Unitas, as I had mentioned earlier. So I think the trend on the investment angle is towards enabling women leaders, which is again a good thing. And a lot of our corporate members also are working in the whole enablement of women entrepreneurs, because there is a lot of financial literacy about running a business. There's a lot of enablement that is required when they've led a life without it for long years. So I think that's an important piece, which is being addressed in pockets. It's actually, if you see all of this coming together, I think there'd be a lot of wonderful things happening. But yes, it's anecdotal, it's happening in pockets, but directionally, I think this gender lens investing is a good trend that has begun.
That's really great to hear, and gives me a lot of confidence in what we can do, that the money's behind it as well. So thank you for leaving us there. And one final question to all the panelists, and this is how we like to end each of the sessions in this webinar series. If you can be very brief in one sentence, what do you see from your perspective and your personal work as the future of low-cost private schools? And Azad, I'll start with you.
I think that they're here to stay. And I think what we need to do is to create ecosystems so that the lessons coming out of them and the data and all of this can be amplified and heard within the policy conversation, because I feel like that's a big missing piece right now.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. And Anjali?
Sure, yeah. I think they are a necessary partner to the government right now. And that they need to be around to be able to cater to all of the needs of the education in the country. So they're definitely necessary, and they need to work in partnership with the government. Yeah.
I agree as well. And Lavanya, last but not least.
Yeah, there's a pressure when you have to end the session, right?
Something inspiring, Lavanya.
Yeah, what can I do with? But well, I completely agree. I mean, the low-cost private schools, they've been affordable, they've been accessible. I've read somewhere we just need to make them more accountable. And I think if that happens, they're really representing 90 million students, which is the population of Germany. I mean, so that's the scale of what is the onus on them. So I think they are a partner in building the youth of our country, which I believe in 15 years will be 140 million. I'm not very good with my memory on numbers, but 140 million in 15 years coming out of these schools. I think we really need to enable them, and as a unit that involves financial institutions, the government, private investors, all of us to come together to make them part of the fold as much as the public school system, as well as the richer private schools.
Absolutely. And so I do see a common theme in greater collaboration, greater integration, and, learning from each other. And so that's what I'd really like to end our session today. Thank you so much to our panelists, to the audience. We will be sharing the recording of this with the summary of the session afterwards. Our next and final session in the series will be on the 30th of November, and it will be focusing on FinTech and EdTech. So thank you so much, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you for having us, and bye, Azad and Anjali.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.